And welcome into our first carrier update of the morning. Bill Priestley here along with Tony Mulvey. We're going to be talking about inbound TEUs here.
Yeah, I'm going to start by looking at the ocean just because it's kind of that upstream indicator of future demand, right? And it's one of those things we look at. We've heard a lot about the destocking phases at retailers and the like, where we realized we had an inventory bubble, inventory glut, however you want to phrase it. We realized we had too much inventory. And that was, I mean, you go back, look at where we were really in 2021 and 2022, and really starting early parts of 2020, right? Or middle to late half of 2020. You just saw all of these import volumes leaving overseas and coming in. You can see the difference and why we realized that we had the inventory issue. You see it in 2022. Once retailers realized that there was a problem, they started reducing the number of orders that they were having. You see that decline. I think the interesting part is how low we really didn't, we kind of right above 2020. You have to remember that was the COVID lockdown period that we were seeing right there, that bottom. So really looking at it, you've seen really growth from the first quarter in through September?
Yep.
Then you see Golden Week. That's what this drop is related to. So that holiday in Far East that is very similar to Lunar New Year, not as extreme, but very similar. And then you see a recovery. And that recovery, in comparison to previous years, has been stronger than what it has before. And I think that's the interesting part when we're looking at it, is that really we were right at 2022, slightly below. We have now inflected positive on these imports leaving overseas and headed to the U.S.
And one of the things I think that's interesting as well is, of course, you see it in the seasonality of it, things taking a real jump as we get to the end of the year. Going to be really interesting to see where this line does end up when we get to December 31st.
Yeah, especially when, I look at it at 2021, you see that increase. There was still this, we needed the orders, there was still the congestion to work through, things like that helped prop this up, especially during that time. We'll flip it over and look at China, just because it is that largest trade that comes from overseas through the ports, right? We can talk about Mexico and Canada and where their place in that. But China, when we're talking about overseas and imports across the ocean, leading partner there, roughly a third of overall ocean TEUs come from China. You look at this, you can see the growth, you see the recovery from the impacts from Golden Week this year were greater than what they were in previous years.
Yes.
But the recovery was also stronger than what it was in previous years. I think this one's the more interesting because you saw this growth that really started in right after the Lunar New Year. We've been growing ever since. Seeing this lower than where it was in September is not a surprise. That's the peak season on the ocean. So we've come down from the peak. But in comparison, we're right at 2021 levels, which I think is probably the more interesting thing. Is this isn't a factor of demand, right? Demand has actually grown over the past few years.
Right.
What's affecting domestic transportation is the fact that there's too much capacity in the market.
Yeah.
And I think this highlights that upstream even better. The other thing to look at is what's going on with rates, because the ocean carriers, they act as, I don't want to say monopoly, but they're nine carriers, 10 carriers make up 90% of the market share. So they have the ability to flex capacity in ways that the truckload market doesn't.
Yeah.
Thus, they can push rates up. And you see these 1 week spikes where they can, hey, we'll blank sailings, we'll cancel sailings, we're just going to try to put upward pressure on rates. When the market is strong, they have the ability to sustain that upward movement, you can see it in the peak, right? That demand was there, people needed that stuff moved, the rates stayed higher, not as volatile as it was in previous year or earlier in the year.
Yeah.
They've tried to do that now, but they've slowly started coming back. I think that's something to pay attention to as we move forward.
It's going to be really interesting there as well. Thank you very much for our first carrier update. Tony, we'll jump over to Kaylee next for our first check of headlines from FreightWaves.com.